You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, Lend-Lease, our summer podcast spinoff. We're recording this on Sunday, August 11th, 2019. This is our long-awaited American Anarchy episode about anarchism and syndicalist movements in the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States. And this is something that I've been talking about for several weeks now that we were going to be doing because we've been working really hard on this, and I have done a lot of research on this topic. This is going to be more than one episode, certainly. So we're starting off with episode 10 and then presumably moving into episode 11 from there of our show. So again, this is our historical podcast that we're doing this summer, and we're focusing this time, as I said, on this sort of forgotten or somewhat forgotten chapter of American leftism in the United States compared to, we've talked about a lot of socialists running for various offices and things like that. A few weeks ago, we did an episode about, municipal socialist candidates and that sort of thing. But we're going to be talking about something that has sort of faded into obscurity a little bit because of, last week's episode, which Nate and I were talking with Greg about, like the Communist Party USA and that sort of thing. This is, we're talking before the Russian Revolution makes communism sort of the dominant force in the global left. There was this period where anarchism and syndicalism, and we'll get into what those are, was certainly prominent as a competing force. So this week joining me back again on the line from Idaho, which is actually, of course, as we've talked about on previous episodes, one of the heartlands of a lot of this anarchist and syndicalist organizing. Rachel, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Bill.
And also joining us on the line again this week is Nate. Hi, Nate.
Hello. Hey, Rachel.
So one of the reasons that I kind of was interested in doing an episode on this, obviously, I have been somewhat aware of the sort of syndicalist model, which we're about to talk about, of organizing labor and industry and things like that, particularly because there's basically not a whole lot of people that are too concerned about syndicalists in the 21st century, except like John Birch Society weirdos, and they're still really worried about this movement that has largely passed into obscurity outside of, like, I guess, Latin America at this point. But they're still very worried about that. So I remember seeing some John Birch Society thing, probably 10 years ago at this point, really freaking out about, interwar and pre-war syndicalism. But then more recently, Nate and I and some other of our friends have been, dabbling around with the game Hearts of Iron 4, and specifically the very popular mod to that game called Kaiserreich, which is basically this alternate history where the U.S. does not get into World War I and then eventually collapses into a second American Civil War, and that the German Empire sort of wins, but more of a draw, World War I, and the Russian Revolution does not go in the Bolshevik direction, and there is a revolution in Britain and France and Italy and the Allied powers after, years of stalemate, and they are, because the Americans don't arrive to, stabilize the situation, their sort of left-wing movements, which were largely syndicalist, as we'll talk about, ended up overthrowing them, and in this world that they've created in this mod, syndicalism rather than communism is the dominant force, and it's sort of it's an interesting alt history thought experiment, and they've put all kinds of details and various characters. Some of the people that we'll be talking about today are certainly key figures in that. But there was definitely a period, right essentially around the beginning of World War I, before the Russian Revolution happens, where you had two very significantly divergent strains of leftism, and either one of them could have become the dominant version of leftism in the 20th century. And it happens that in the United States, the probably more prominent one in this period, and even later to some extent, still very dominant compared to a lot of places, continued to be the anarchists and syndicalists. So we wanted to talk a little bit about that. So We'll talk first about some of the sort of origins and why it took root in the United States in a way that is not true of some other places in the world. And we'll talk about kind of the theory and definitions and so forth. So to start off, of course, I don't know about you guys. When I thought, for a long time of the anarchists and stuff, you'd be thinking of like the dudes in the black masks and stuff, and like in middle school people like writing the A in the circle and all that. And I didn't really know what that was. Do you guys remember like what your earlier impressions of what anarchism was? I feel like it's definitely not as well like even understood in popular culture as say like communism. At least people have like kind of a basic understanding of what that is.
Well, I remember like as a kid in the 90s, the protests in Seattle during what was it, the World Trade Organization riots but I was so young, it was just kind of a vague like concept of what was happening, and then you just saw like the black bloc anarchists just like smashing windows and stuff like that. So that's kind of the initial impression I had as a kid before I really learned like what their ideology and philosophy actually entailed.
Right, because I mean, if it's just like them, you see the images of them fighting with the police or whatever, which this is, as we'll talk about, became like a staple of newspaper coverage and stuff, in the 20th century, of it's just this, lawless, random violence, and there's no ideology. And of course, in most cases, especially in the period we'll be talking about, they were not even instigating violence at all. But yeah, I feel like I didn't have a great grasp, as you said, of like what the ideology of this was. Nate, do you remember like any of that stuff from like a while back?
I mean, sure. I remember a guy was like, "Oh, I'm an anarchist," and I was like, sort of, wait, doesn't that just mean no rules? Sort of the typical conception of what that was. Although,
Right.
he was clearly a little more serious about that, and it sort of gave me the recognition that, okay, there's maybe a bit more going on here philosophically. And then, of course, you have the influences from, say, Chomsky or Howard Zinn, who lived in the city we grew up in. So there's a little bit of that anarcho-syndicalism in sort of the popular media, at least sort of on the anti-Bush left or whatever, which
Right.
to whatever extent that existed at the time. But that was, at the time, a little more palatable for sort of, as I was talking about, the liberals that were opposed to Bush than like hardline Marxist-Leninism or like, hammer and sickle type of stuff. So that's probably why I think, in addition to the WTO protests, it's sort of like regained a bit of, prominence in America.
Yeah. So we're going to definitely get into that issue of violence and things like propaganda of the deed attacks and things like that. But that's really kind of not the primary focus of what we want to talk about here. So I want to, as I said, start off by talking about like what kind of is the theory, and especially in the American version of this, because there's some distinctions, with the sort of the European background. So, pre-industrial American anarchism starts before the Civil War, and it tended to be of the individualist tendency, which fit very nicely into a broader American mythos of this self-sufficient, rugged individualism, which is apart from the government. So sometimes you'd be actively but peacefully opposing it. That was the Henry David Thoreau model when he was opposing the imperialism of the Mexican War, or opposing slavery. And this sort of early American thing was also a counterpart to these other movements, which we've talked about sometimes on the show as well, that were happening at the same time. These communalist and mutualist movements. There's a lot of utopianism going on, and we might retroactively call that anarcho-communist, but they didn't really kind of tend to call it that at the time because they didn't necessarily have the vocabulary that we have for it. So anarcho-syndicalism, which is also known as, especially in modern vocabulary and especially in Latin America, when you read news articles about that, you'll also hear anarcho-syndicalism referred to as trade unionism. So if someone's a trade unionist that gets assassinated by the government, that usually means they're espousing a specific ideology. It's not just that they're a union organizer alone. The non-individualist and non-commune variety of anarchism obviously comes later in the United States with industrialization. So you can't really have industrial anarchism until you have the Industrial Revolution, and especially the Second Industrial Revolution after the American Civil War. The proto-anarchism of that pre-war period was deeply pacifist. It was individualist, so it's completely different from, the terrorist attacks that would later be associated with anarchism. And that fits well ideologically, if not tactically, with anti-government and individualist anarchism, which we were starting to see in Europe at that point from people like Proudhon. So Pierre-Joseph Proudhon from France, he called anarchism, quote, the absence of a master or of a sovereign. Eventually, a lot of this theoretical stuff is emerging more especially after the American Civil War, is more emerging in Europe. And, this is the same time that you've got people like Marx writing his theories of, what a leftist movement should look like. So there's all these different guys debating different theories. There's eventually this very bitter split in the 1880s, even within, some of the anarchist tendencies. And it's worth noting that individualist anarchism of the early 19th century in the United States probably has more in common philosophically with what we would today call right libertarianism in the United States than it does with the rest of modern anarchism. But of course, right libertarianism is really obsessed with like racism and guns and property rights, and that's also not really consistent with a lot of early anarchism. And of course, the sort of primary split in the 1880s in theoretical, tendencies of anarchism is over the issue of violence, which we'll talk about later. But that's still more of like a tactical thing than a theoretical or ideological thing. So that's sort of the pre-industrial anarchism, and then at the writing at sort of the very, like, maybe a year or two after the peak point of industrial trade unionism, anarcho-syndicalism, and so forth, we can get in this is at the end of World War I. We have Lord Bertrand Russell's book, Proposed Roads to Freedom, Socialism, Anarchism, and Syndicalism, which he published in 1918. So for those who don't know, Bertrand Russell was this British aristocrat by birth. His grandfather had been prime minister twice. But despite this background, he was a political essayist and author who studied leftist movements and was basically himself a leftist of, whatever tendency. And he is writing this book in 1918 just before sort of syndicalism goes out of style because of, what's happening in Russia. And, so we have 1914, you have World War I starts. Almost all of the leftist movements in Europe come to a compromise, thinking the war will be over quickly, and they don't want to be on the wrong side of, this patriotic nationalist sentiment. So they all compromise with their national governments, and that, they're not going to do strikes, etc. After a number of years, this starts breaking down. You have the 1917 Russian revolutions. You have mutinies across France. Everyone's just getting tired of how long this war is dragging on, and so on. And at that point, you see this brief moment where it looks like syndicalism could potentially reemerge as this strong force. And, again, we talked about that's sort of the premise of that Kaiserreich computer game. And then by 1920... it's clear that there's going to be this Bolshevik Russian state with this communist model instead, and there's this, you start seeing these factional splits around the global left between people who are, they don't want to have anything to do with the dictatorship of the proletariat and state communism, versus they think, well, here's a leftist workers' state and we have to support it because it's here. So Bertrand Russell was a committed pacifist during World War I. He was convicted of refusing conscription. He subsequently went on to be on an official British mission, diplomatic mission to the Soviet Union, where he was very critical of Lenin's regime, despite everyone else on the trip being very impressed. But in 1918, he wrote this book, again, Proposed Roads to Freedom, Socialism, Anarchism, and Syndicalism, where he's talking about these different theories of kind of distinguishing. He also notes that there's a big geographic difference in where these are popular, and that's going to become increasingly important as we talk about the experience in the United States, in no small part due to the fact that immigration has a lot to do with why syndicalism was popular in the United States. And the immigrants, it mattered which immigrants we're talking about and which countries they're coming from. So he said that anarchist tendencies were more popular in Italy, Spain, France, countries like that, which he termed the Latin countries of Europe. Followers of Marx and a state-oriented vision of socialism were more dominant in German-speaking countries. And then I would also editorialize here German-speaking U.S. communities too. And then to a lesser extent in England, there was also this sort of eccentric British tendency, Fabianism, which was basically their vision of a sort of leftist revolution, was basically, well, if we do a re-education campaign of the middle-class workers in the civil service, then it doesn't matter who gets elected to various offices because the civil service is the one who makes all the policies anyway, and they will introduce social democracy through the unelected bureaucracy. This obviously didn't really pan out that way. And then there's also Bakunin, who's a Russian. He was sort of the anarchist counterpart to Marx, and he was sort of a key figure as well. So here are the definitions of the different tendencies that we're talking about, according to Russell, writing in 1918. In the popular mind, an anarchist is a person who throws bombs and commits other outrages, either because he is more or less insane or because he uses the pretense of extreme political opinions as a cloak for criminal proclivities. This view, of course, is in every way inadequate. Some anarchists believe in throwing bombs, many do not. Men of almost every other shade of opinion believe in throwing bombs in suitable circumstances. For example, the men who threw bomb at Sarajevo and started the present war were not anarchists at all, but nationalists. Anarchists who are in favor of bomb throwing do not in this respect differ on any vital principle from the rest of the community, with the exception that an infinitesimal portion adopt the Tolstoyan attitude of non-resistance. Anarchists, like socialists, usually believe in the doctrine of the class war. If they use bombs, it is as the government uses bombs, for the purpose of war. But for every bomb manufactured by an anarchist, millions are manufactured by governments. And for every man killed by anarchist violence, many millions are killed by the violence of states. We may therefore dismiss from our minds the whole question of violence, which plays so large a part in the popular imagination, since it is neither essential nor peculiar to those who adopt the anarchist position. Anarchism, as its derivation indicates, is the theory which is opposed to every kind of forcible government. It is opposed to the state as the embodiment of the force employed in the government of the community. Such government as anarchism can tolerate must be a free government, not merely in the sense that it is of a majority, but in the sense that it is assented to by all. Anarchists object to such institutions as the police and the criminal law, by means of which the will of one part of the community is forced upon another part. In their view, the democratic form of government is not very enormously preferable to other forms, so long as minorities remain compelled by force or its potentiality to submit to the will of majorities. Liberty is the supreme good of the anarchist creed, and liberty is sought by the direct road of abolishing all forcible control over the individual by the community. The modern anarchism, in the sense which we shall be concerned with, is associated with the belief in communal ownership of land and capital, and it is thus, in an important respect, akin to socialism. This doctrine is properly called anarchist communism, but as it embraces practically all modern anarchism, we may ignore the individualist anarchism altogether and concentrate attention upon the communistic form. Socialism and anarchist communism alike have arisen from the perception that private capital is a source of tyranny by certain individuals over others. Orthodox socialism believes that the individual will become free if the state becomes the sole capitalist. Anarchism, on the contrary, fears that in the case the state might merely inherit the tyrannical propensities of the private capitalist, which I guess editorializing here is probably what a lot of the critics would say of what happened with the Soviet Union, especially if they're anarchist critics. Accordingly, it seeks for a means of reconciling communal ownership with the utmost possible diminution of the powers of the state, and indeed, ultimately, with the complete abolition of the state. It has arisen mainly within the socialist movement as its extreme left wing. And now this brings us to the next sort of theoretical definition that Bertrand Russell is making. The economic organization of society, as conceived by anarchist communists, does not greatly differ from that which is sought by socialists. Their difference from socialists is in the matter of government. They demand that the government shall require the consent of all the governed, and not only of a majority. It is undeniable that the rule of a majority may be almost as hostile to freedom as the rule of a minority. The divine right of majorities is a dogma as little possessed of absolute truth as any other. A strong democratic state may easily be led into oppression of its best citizens, namely those whose independence of mind would make them a force for progress. Experience of democratic parliamentary government has shown that it falls very short of what is expected of it by early socialists, and the anarchist revolt against it is not surprising. But in the pure form of anarchism, this revolt has remained weak and sporadic. It is syndicalism and the movements to which syndicalism has given rise that has popularized the revolt against parliamentary government and purely political means of emancipating the wage earner. But this movement must be dealt with in a separate chapter. So then I went to the separate chapter to find out more. France, unlike England and Germany, was not content merely to repeat the old shibboleths with continually diminishing conviction. And then I would say that what he means about that is a parliamentary electoral socialism was gaining movement dominance there, and France was unwilling to go along with that. In France, a new movement, originally known as revolutionary syndicalism and afterwards simply as syndicalism, kept alive the vigor of the original impulse and remained true to the spirit of the older socialists while departing from the letter. Syndicalism, unlike socialism and anarchism, began from an existing organization and developed the ideas appropriate to it, whereas socialism and anarchism began with the ideas and only afterward developed the organizations which were their vehicle. In order to understand syndicalism, we first have to describe trade union organization in France and its political environment. The ideas of syndicalism will then appear as the natural outcome of the political and economic situation. Hardly any of these ideas are new. Almost all are derived from the Bakuninist section of the Old International. The Old International had considerable success in France before the Franco-Prussian War. Indeed, in 1869, it is estimated to have had a French membership of 250,000. What is practically the syndicalist program was advocated by a French delegate to the Congress of the International at Bâle in the same year. The disputes between the various sections of socialists caused difficulties inside the trade unions and helped bring about the resolution to keep politics out of the unions, which, keep that marked because that's going to be important when we get to the U.S. context. From this to syndicalism was an easy step. And then Russell notes that there was a series of French politicians who got elected to various powerful positions. They, pursued electoralism, got appointed to the cabinets, and then suddenly turned against socialism. This convinced a lot of radicals that state politics was a mistake to be avoided. So then they were looking for an alternative. Syndicalism stands essentially for the point of view of the producer as opposed to that of the consumer. It is concerned with reforming actual work and the organization of industry, not merely with securing greater rewards for work. From this point of view, its vigor and its distinctive character are derived. It aims at substituting industrial for political action and at using trade union organization for purposes for which orthodox socialism would look to the parliament. Syndicalism was originally only the French name for trade unionism, but the trade unionists of France became divided into two sections, the reformist and the revolutionary, of whom the latter only professed the ideas which we now associate with the term syndicalism. It is quite impossible to guess how far either the organization or the ideas of syndicalists will remain intact at the end of this war, and everything that we shall say is to be taken as applying only to the years before the war. It may be that French syndicalism, as a distinctive movement, will be dead, which, not completely dead, but it certainly lost a lot of juice after that. And then he describes, because he said that it was important to understand the French structure to understand how they came up with this theory of revolution. So the French CGT was a loose central committee of 700 unions called syndicates, hence the name syndicalism. The FBT was a federation of labor councils representing all the workers across all occupations in a given location geographically. From 1902 onward, they combined the CGT and the FBT together to have a dual membership and dual federalism system where every geographic area was represented, but also every industry nationwide was represented, so that decision-making would neither be overly local nor overly national or dominated by one single industry. The CGT-FBT was governed by turn-of-the-century French anarchists who tried to avoid any centralization even within the organization, and they tried to be more advisory rather than directing labor action in specific disputes. Russell notes that, quote, the committee had no chairman and votes very rarely took place. The CGT allows much autonomy to each unit in the organization. Each syndicate counts for one, whether it be large or small. He also notes there is a reformist section in the CGT, but is practically always in the minority, and the CGT is, to all intents and purposes, the organ of revolutionary syndicalism, which is simply the creed of its leaders. The essential doctrine of syndicalism is the class war, to be conducted by industrial rather than political methods. The chief industrial methods advocated are the strike, the boycott, the label, and sabotage. The boycott, in various forms, and the label, showing that the work has been done under trade union conditions, have played a considerable part in American labor struggles. Sabotage is the practice of doing bad work, or spoiling the machinery or work that has already been done, as a method of dealing with employers in a dispute when a strike appears for some reason undesirable or impossible. It has many forms, some clearly innocent, some open to grave objections. One form of sabotage which has been adopted by shop assistants is to tell customers the truth about the articles they are buying. This form, however, may damage the shopkeeper's business, but it is not easy to object to on moral grounds. So basically, if you say, well, you came in here to buy this thing, but actually it sucks. You should go somewhere else. They have better product. And then someone goes somewhere else and they spend their money elsewhere. Well, now you've sabotaged your employer, but you told the truth. So, you weren't really doing anything morally wrong. And then he says, a form which has been adopted on railways, particularly in Italian strikes, is that of obeying all rules literally and exactly in such a way as to make the running of trains practically impossible. So work to rule, except hardcore version of that. Another form is to do all work with minute care so that in the end it is better done, but the output is small. From these innocent forms, there is a continual progression until we come to such acts as all ordinary morality would consider criminal, such as causing railway accidents, although he's making clear here that that's not very frequently used as a tactic. By far the most important of the syndicalist methods is the strike. Ordinary strike, for specific objectives, are regarded as rehearsals, or the means of perfecting organization and promoting enthusiasm. But even when they are victorious so far as concerns of the specific point in dispute, they are not regarded as by syndicalists as affording any ground for industrial peace. Syndicalists aim at using the strike not to secure such improvements of detail as employers may grant, but to destroy the whole system of employer and employed, and win the complete emancipation of the worker. For this purpose, what is wanted is the general strike, the complete cessation of work by a sufficient proportion of the wage earners as to secure the paralysis of capitalism. Sorel, who represents syndicalism too much in the minds of the reading public, suggests that the general strike is to be regarded as a myth, like the second coming in Christian doctrine. But this view by no means suits active syndicalists. If they were brought to believe that the general strike is mere myth, their energy would flag and their whole outlook would become disillusioned. It is the actual vivid belief in its possibility which inspires them. They are much criticized for this belief by the political socialists who consider that the battle is to be won by obtaining a parliamentary majority. Syndicalists, however, have too little faith in the honesty of politicians to place any reliance on such a method, or to believe in the value of any revolution which leaves the power of the state intact. And then he goes on to talk about various other things and emphasizing that they did not have, because of the fact that they emerged out of a specific union that was trying to avoid politics rather than emerging out of someone's theory, their theories are a little bit less well-defined than, some of the socialists and so forth, and that syndicalism tends to be much more concrete about tactical details rather than sort of the overall revolutionary doctrine. Comments here before I continue?
To kind of go back to the discussion about sabotage, one famous example is dumping sugar into concrete, and that kind of halts the chemical bonding from happening. And I just wanted to point that out because of the recent false allegations that protesters in Portland were putting concrete in milkshakes or something like that and throwing them at people that they don't agree with politically, because as any good anarchist would know, that absolutely wouldn't work in harming people. Kind of tying that into current events.
Yeah, that was definitely there was a media narrative there, and basically the attempt was to paint any anti-fascist activist as like, a mustachioed anarchist with like one of those like bombs that has like, like the fuse, and it's like perfectly spherical, and he's just chucking it at someone. And that was basically
joined by his friend with the money bag with the dollar sign.
Right, but like the narrative hasn't changed as we're seeing. So
yeah. Well, that's the other reason to talk about this stuff now is because so much of this stuff is just an endless loop of the same stuff that was happening 100 years ago and sort of the propaganda against these things. So Russell notes as well, the doctrines of syndicalism may be illustrated by an article introducing it to English readers in the first number of The Syndicalist Railwaymen, September 1911, from which the following is quoted. All syndicalism, collectivism, anarchism aims at abolishing the present economic status and existing private ownership of most things. But while collectivism would substitute ownership by everybody and anarchism ownership by nobody, syndicalism aims at ownership by organized labor. It is thus a purely trade union reading of the economic doctrine and class war preached by socialism. It vehemently repudiates parliamentary action on which collectivism relies. And it is in this respect much more closely allied to anarchism, from which indeed it differs in practice only in being more limited in range of action. In truth, so thin is the partition between syndicalism and anarchism, according to Russell, that the newer and less familiar ism has shrewdly been defined as organized anarchy. It has been created by the trade unions of France. And this is going to prove to be very true in the United States as well. Obviously, there's a lot of people coming around with similar ideas at the same time, but by the time this spreads to the United States, it's very explicitly based off of what was happening in France. Russell says that anarchism and syndicalism are essentially sympathetic toward each other, except that anarchism is focused on violent revolution against the state military to abolish the state, whereas syndicalism is focused on achieving a revolution to abolish the state via the mechanism of the general strike. And this is one of the most critical pieces in all of this that I've read, is that he notes that the recognition here, though, is that by the time you got to a point where you could successfully organize and stage a massive general strike that completely shut down like the entire economy of a country or region or whatever, sufficient to take power. By the time you had achieved that level of organization necessary to do that, you would basically you wouldn't need to fight the army, the state power that's backing the ownership class and the political class, because you would have already become so powerful. So that's sort of the critique that was a lot of the socialists were making, especially in the context of World War I. But before we get to the success of the Russian Revolution and things like that, it's like, well, how do you get past this enormous state military power, which was a sort of central debate, as I think we'll talk about, with in the 19th century. They were, people like Marx and Engels were worried about this question too. That's why a lot of socialists ended up turning to parliamentary action. Was, well, how can you stage an armed revolution against an industrial army of the size of, say, the one that existed in Germany and so forth. And as Russell says, the syndicalists retort that when the movement is strong enough to win by armed insurrection, it would be abundantly strong enough to win by the general strike. And success through violence can hardly be expected to succeed, except in circumstances where success without violence is already attainable. So one of the core things about this notion of a syndicalist general strike, and therefore, in one fell swoop, achieving a workers' revolution and taking control of the economy, is that you don't need to pursue, a violent civil war because you have already achieved such a level of strength that they would just capitulate to at that point. Obviously, I think you can see why some people might disagree with that philosophy, but that is sort of the theoretical answer to that question. And that was also, as Russell says, the core argument that the syndicalists would use to critique the anarchists who were supporting more violent methods. And then here's the sort of really critical thing. Although the American syndicalists would be inspired by the French syndicalists were actually drawing on the American roots. So Russell says, syndicalism stands for what is known as industrial unionism as opposed to craft unionism. In this respect, as also in the preference of industrial over political methods, it is part of a movement which has spread far beyond France. The distinction between industrial and craft unionism is much dwelt on by Mr. Cole. Craft unionism, according to Cole, unites in a single association those workers who are engaged in a single industrial process or on processes so nearly akin that any can do another's work. But organization may follow the lines not of the work done, but of the actual structure of industry. All workers working at producing a particular kind of commodity may be organized in a single union. The basis of organization would be neither the craft to which a man belonged, nor the employer under whom he worked, but the service on which he was engaged. This is industrial unionism, again, as contrasted with craft unionism. Industrial unionism is a product of America, and from America it has to some extent spread to Great Britain. It is the natural form of fighting organization when the union is regarded as the means of carrying on the class war, with a view not to obtaining this or that minor amelioration, but to a radical revolution in the economic system. This is the point of view adopted by the industrial workers of the world, commonly known as the IWW. This corresponds more or less in America to what the CGT was in France before the war. The differences between those two, however, are those due to the different economic circumstances of the two countries, but their spirit is closely analogous. The IWW is not united as to the ultimate form which it wishes society to take. There are socialists, anarchists, and syndicalists among its members. But it is clear that on the immediate practical issue, that the class war is a fundamental reality in the present relations of labor and capital, and that it is by industrial action, especially by the strike, that emancipation must be sought. The IWW, like the CGT, is not nearly so strong as numerically as it is supposed to be by those who fear it. Its influence is based not upon its numbers, but upon its power of enlisting sympathies of the workers in moments of crisis. The labor movement has been characterized on both sides by very great violence. Indeed, the secretary of the CGT, M. Jouot, recognizes that the CGT is mild in comparison with the IWW. The IWW, he says, preaches a policy of militant action, very necessary in parts of America, which we would not do in France. A very interesting account of it from the point of view of an author who is neither wholly on the side of labor nor wholly on the side of the capitalist, but disinterestedly anxious to find some solution of the social question short of violence of the revolution, is the work of Mr. John Graham Brooks, called American Syndicalism, the IWW. American labor conditions are very different from those of Europe. In the first place, the power of trusts is enormous. The concentration of capital has in this respect proceeded more nearly along Marxian lines in America than anywhere else. In the second place, the great influx of foreign labor makes the whole problem quite different from any that arises in Europe. The older skilled workers, largely American-born, have long been organized in the American Federation of Labor under Mr. Gompers. These represent an aristocracy of labor. They tend to work with the employers against the great mass of unskilled immigrants, and they cannot be regarded as forming a part of anything that could be truly called a labor movement. There are, says Mr. Cole, now in America 2 working classes, with different standards of life, and both are at present almost impotent in the faces of the employers. Nor is it possible for these 2 working classes to unite or to put forward any demands. The American Federation of Labor and the industrial workers of the world represent 2 different principles of combination, but they also represent 2 different classes of labor. The IWW stands for industrial unionism, whereas the American Federation of Labor stands for craft unionism. And again, this is going to become more and more important as we explore the formation of the IWW and the immigrant experience in the United States and all of these different factors that differentiated their approach and who they were representing. The IWW, though it has a less definite philosophy than French syndicalism, is quite equally determined to destroy the capitalist system. As its secretary has said, there is but one bargain the IWW will make with the employing class: complete surrender of all control of industry to the organized workers. Mr. Haywood of the Western Federation of Miners is an out-and-out follower of Marx so far as concerns the class war and doctrine of surplus value. But like all who are in this movement, he attaches more importance to industrial action against political action than do the European followers of Marx. This is no doubt partly explicable by the special circumstances of America, where the recent immigrants are apt to be voteless. I want to interject here with my own commentary on this, which is that in 1912, the Socialist Party of America formally opposed sabotage and removed Bill Haywood from leadership and purged almost any of the syndicalists who were even willing to engage in some form of electoralism. And they basically all left the party en masse. And of course, we're going to be talking more about this, especially in the next part, not in this part of the episode, about this aspect of immigrants and why this votelessness becomes certainly key. Although I was thinking a lot about this as we were watching ICE raids happening in Mississippi. The immigrant poultry plant workers were in the process of unionizing. All of a sudden, there's a huge raid and hundreds of them get deported. And then the state says, hey, look who's hiring. There's jobs open. So this issue remains pretty relevant, the electoralism versus abstaining from electoralism and trying to pursue industrial organization and industrial action because of this issue of immigrants being voteless. Russell notes that the fourth convention of the IWW revised a preamble giving the general principles underlying its action. The working class and the employing class, they say, have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of the working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things in life. Between these two classes, a struggle must go on until the workers of the world organize as a class, take possession of the earth and the machinery of production, and abolish the wage system. Instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wages for a fair day's work, we must inscribe on our banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wage system. And then finally, the last section that I wanted to note from Russell, he notes that numerous strikes have been conducted or encouraged by the IWW and the Western Federation of Miners. These strikes illustrate the class war in a more bitter and extreme form than is to be found in any other part of the world. Again, remember, this is being written in 1918. World War I hasn't finished, and the Russian Revolution is still just getting underway. Both sides are always ready to resort to violence. That, I think, is a little bit misleading, but that's his take on it. The employers have armies of their own and are able to call upon the militia, and even in crisis upon the United States Army. What French syndicalists say about the state as a capitalist institution is particularly true in America. In consequence of the scandals thus arising, the federal government appointed a Commission on Industrial Relations, whose report in 1915 reveals a state of affairs such as would be difficult to imagine in Great Britain. The report states that the greatest disorders in most of the outbreaks of violence in connection with industrial disputes arise from the violation of what are considered to be fundamental rights, and from the perversion or subversion of governmental institutions. It mentions among such perversions the subservience of the judiciary to military authorities, the fact that during labor disputes the life and liberty of every man within the state would seem to be at the mercy of the governor, and the use of state troops in policing strikes. At Ludlow, Colorado, in 1914, a battle of the militia and the miners took place, in which the result of the fire of the militia, a number of women and children were burned to death. Many other instances of pitched battles could be given, but enough has been said to show the peculiar character of labor disputes in the United States. It may, I fear, be presumed that this character will remain so long as a very large proportion of labor consists of recent immigrants. When these difficulties pass away, as they must sooner or later, labor will more and more find its place in the community and will tend to feel and inspire less of the bitter hostility, which renders the more extreme forms of class warfare possible. When that time comes, the labor movement in America will probably begin to take on forms similar to those of Europe. So that's Bertrand Russell's sort of contemporary account at the very end of the high point of American syndicalism and even European syndicalism, more or less. And that, I think, gives a good understanding of the context that they had arrived at and the overall theory. The reason I read that first rather than starting chronologically at the beginning is because, as he said at the beginning of that, the theories of syndicalism derive from the existing organization and their tactical experiences and strategic lessons they've learned, more so than it does stem from a coherent ideology and theory that they then try to build an organization to follow through on that. I was wondering, is that something that you guys have heard about before? Because I feel like this is not something that gets any attention in like the history curriculum in school.
Yeah, absolutely not. Like I think because I'm from Idaho and I kind of heard about the Steunenberg trial back in the day, like feel like it got a little bit of education, but it was very surface level and didn't really go into any of the like factions or any of the different tendencies. So yeah, I don't think this got touched on in history class on any sort of deeper level.
Nate, how about you?
Not that I can remember, really.
I feel like everything becomes focused on the communism, right? Like the especially after the Russian Revolution.
Well, it depends what we're talking about, because like they usually, like when they talk about the Red Scare, it does get separated into like the first and second Red Scare, and so like a lot of the first is such focused on the anti-anarchist action,
right, which we'll definitely be getting to
McCarthyism, and
yeah,
but depends sort of the specificity or quality of the class or whatever.
So again, just to sort of outline where we're going with this rest of this, since it's not just a one-part episode on this topic, we're going to be talking about the creation of the IWW and some of their experiences. Some of that overlaps with some of the things we've talked about on other episodes of either our summer podcast or the radio show before that. Like Rachel just alluded to the trial in Idaho over the assassination of the governor. That's something that's going to come up. We're also going to talk more specifically about that issue of violence, the propaganda of the deed anarchists, the Haymarket bombing affair, the first Red Scare, anti-syndicalist criminal legislation. We're going to talk about the role of immigrants, the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, which is obviously something that does get taught in schools in Massachusetts, although, maybe with a different emphasis than we would put on it. And we're obviously going to talk as well throughout this as they come up about some of the really important women of this movement who Rachel has been researching up on. So let's talk about the IWW. There was I actually had to go get some pretty old books from the library to be able to do this topic because of how much the anarcho-syndicalist phase of American leftism has faded from the popular imagination. One of the ones I'll be talking about later is a book on criminal syndicalism legislation in the United States, which was published in 1935. But the really helpful book that I found from 1967 by a British author, Patrick Renshaw, was The Wobblies, The Story of Syndicalism in the United States. And he goes over the history of how we arrived at the creation of the IWW, how they settled on their sort of ideology, which again follows more out of practicality than, it does from some unified theory that already existed. So during the 1890s, industrial unions seeking to organize around the entire supply chain rather than specific occupations, which is what a craft union would do, emerged as strong rivals of the somewhat more conservative and siloed craft unions centered on the American Federation of Labor, which we'll be referring to as the AFL from here on out. So both types of American unions, interestingly, were pretty generally opposed to legislative and parliamentarist strategies. So we've talked a lot about on the show about the progressive movement, which was a more middle-class white-collar movement for various reforms, that they would pass, referendums became a thing, constitutional conventions and reforms happened. That was what the progressives were working on, and this was not really what the unions were focused on during this period of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But both the craft unions under the AFL and the industrial unions that would eventually form the IWW did not agree with this approach. The craft unions tended to be representing sort of more well-off, more highly skilled laborers. They were also kind of the stronger basis of a lot of unions in Europe in the Industrial Revolution and Second Industrial Revolution before we get to this phase of the 1890s and so forth. But all over the world, we start seeing in the 1890s the emergence of these industrial unions. Now, again, going back to that theory component, basically what we're talking about here is trying to organize everyone who works on a relevant industry, regardless of their specific occupation, into a combined union. This is the slogan that the later IWW would use, was one big union. So that was the objective of industrial unionization as opposed to craft unionization. So the heavily German-American Industrial National Union of Brewery Workmen of the United States, formed in 1884. They organized along industrial lines. They organized the brewers, the drivers, the maltsters, the firemen, and even the stenographers. They soon left the much more conservative and loosely structured Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor was something we've talked about on previous episodes as well, which was like a kind of very loosey-goosey proto-union thing that was popular for a bit after the Civil War in the United States. But anyway, they left that because they weren't really doing much for them. They tried to join the AFL, but they ran into difficulty because they had a non-craft structure. So again, if you have stenographers working in the same union as the brewers, because they all work at the brewing factory, they all make the brewing process happen, they get the beers to where people need to go, that makes sense if you're organizing along industrial lines. It doesn't make sense if you're organizing along craft lines in the way that the AFL preferred. A few years later, the United Mine Workers of America formed, and they joined the AFL, but they were completely industrial in nature, and due to their enormous scale within the union movement, the AFL basically had to go along with it because there were so many of them. Now, a lot of these people that we start seeing in this period, inside and outside of the AFL, dealing with this issue of industrial versus craft unionism, go on to become very important in the formation of the IWW. So, Eugene V. Debs, very well known, I think, by a lot of Americans, even if they don't know a whole lot about the left, because of his multiple campaigns for president and so forth. Future socialist politician. At this point in time, he's not a socialist politician yet. He led the brand new American Railway Union out of the AFL in 1893. He was explicitly repudiating the craft model, which had not worked for rail strikers amid the 1893 railroad financial crashes. So a whole bunch of railroad companies all over the U.S. went bankrupt all at once. There was all kinds of fallout from that. Various things were happening. There was an attempted strike in 1893, didn't go very well. So he forms this new union that's an industrial rail union as opposed to a craft rail union. So to give a better understanding of what we're talking about in this distinction, Debs had come up through the ranks of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen. So that's a very good example of a very specialized craft union. Those are the guys that were shoveling the coal from the tender into the boiler on the steam locomotive to make the trains go, right? But they're in a different union than the engineers. They're in a different union than the conductors. They're in a different union than the guys who work in the rail yards, and so on and so forth. So even though they're all operating trains, they're all making the train industry and the rail industry function, they're all in different unions. And he saw this as an inappropriate model. Also, one of the problems that ended up happening was that in many cases, companies would come up with very elaborate negotiations where they would give certain perks to, say, the engineers of the locomotives while taking something away from the firemen so that they could pit them against each other. I don't want to get too far off track, but I've definitely seen, rail fans talking who have a historical understanding of some of this stuff from the left talk about how certain locomotives were literally designed with specifications that would help help the companies navigate around the different unions, so that some of them would be favored and some of them would be hurt based on the design of the locomotive, in terms of how much would they get paid, how many working hours would they have, etc. So the newly formed American Railway Union was attempting to combine all relevant trades and occupations around the industry of the railroad, which was probably the largest industry in the United States at the time, and put them all into one union. This industrial-oriented ARU explodes in popularity and geographic breadth for a very brief shining moment, and probably would have served as a force to completely reorient the entire American rail industry, except that before it could get really off the ground, Debs, against, his better judgment, as Renshaw says, decided to back a doomed 1894 Wildcat Pullman factory strike, which is something I don't even remember. We've probably talked about it on the show. But basically, they were trying to get some Pullman Company factory workers into the ARU. There was a problem at a specific factory. There was a dispute. The workers decided to go on a Wildcat strike, and then asked the ARU to back them nationwide. And because Pullman cars operated on lots of different trains, on lots of different rail lines all over the country, this could have been, had they been more prepared for it, a potentially huge test case for how to conduct a syndicalist general strike, because you could potentially shut down the entire U.S. rail industry, the largest industry in the economy, and if you had everyone on board agreeing that this was a good idea and you should shut down the trains to help the specific Pullman workers with their dispute. However, the AFL refused to support this strike. President Cleveland called out federal troops to break the strike. His legal basis for that was claiming that mail delivery was being interfered with, and that was a federal issue, and there were mail cars on all these trains as well as Pullman cars. And this was probably one of the most famous attempts in the United States to launch a general strike, but it never got the support strikes that were needed to win. Now, the AFL's defense for why they didn't participate was that all of their member craft rail worker unions, the engineers or whatever the supporting unions that hadn't left to go join the ARU, were very conservative and didn't want to participate in this. And they figured, well, the AFL as a whole cannot participate if all of its constituent relevant unions are refusing to participate. This undercut the Pullman strikers and it undercut the ARU, but that, of course, would proves the entire point that the industrial syndicalists were making about the limitations of craft unions. Many workers agreed with this conclusion in the aftermath of the strike, despite its failure, and therefore turned toward industrial unionism and radicalism and away from craft unionism. Many American socialists at the end of the 19th century were also involved in this movement. They were willing to be involved in promoting industrial unionism in a way that many of their mainland European peers were not, because they viewed the socialist position in the United States as being too weak to enter the political sphere without first building a strong workers' movement out in the actual workplaces across America. In this view, the strong industrial labor unions would form, they would gain strength, etc., and they might eventually form a labor party like the one that was emerging in the United Kingdom in the same time period out of the unions there. Now, numerically, but not proportionally, American unions actually ended up doing much stronger in the polls within about a decade or so than their British counterparts, but that's because Britain's population was a lot smaller. In the 1890s, the Socialist Labor Party's Daniel De Leon, who, according to Renshaw, you could roughly compare to Lenin for the United States. That's not exactly an exact comparison, and of course, never ended up successfully staging a revolution like Lenin. But in terms of style and ideological outlook and that sort of thing, he in this time period also pushed American socialism to embrace a twin political and unionist strategy. He said that the capitalists were fighting on both the political and economic fronts against the people, so obviously the workers had to as well. But he continued to insist that working men would eventually simply vote themselves into power in regular elections, which, of course, as we talked about on a recent episode, did actually happen in some cities, but it didn't happen nationally. And many syndicalists criticized this because in a lot of states, especially in the Mountain West, there was just blatant rigging and stuffing of the ballot boxes, in some cases, quote-unquote, recounting elections to make sure that leftists did not actually get elected. But the socialists didn't do very well with their co-option strategy to build a working class union that would serve as a launch pad for a labor party, because they tried this in both the industrial unions and the AFL and the Knights of Labor craft unions. And unfortunately, a lot of less doctrinaire socialists had already actually risen to power in union leadership positions and they knew what the goal was here, and they didn't want infiltration messing up their unions. And the workers who had strong unions, especially the craft unions that were working well for them and getting the things they wanted, were not terribly interested in a revolutionary future where everything would change. This again goes back to that concept of a labor aristocracy. Committed anarchists and syndicalists had no interest in being somebody's stepping stone to a bourgeois electoral party or to a political dictatorship of the proletariat. And finally, De Leon's leadership style and a failed effort to start his own trade union with a socialist perspective led to a split among the socialists and a rejection of socialism by many trade unionists by the end of the 1890s. But he actually did go on to help found the IWW in 1905 after becoming a little bit more interested in the syndicalist theory and practice that was emerging in France. And he realized that if he didn't get in on the ground floor, his party might go extinct. Now we get back a little bit into theory here. So Renshaw analogizes the syndicalist character of industrial unions forming around a giant industrial cartel and monopoly corporations to represent all the different types of workers in the supply chain and production cycle as akin to a shadow government, except for the entire U.S. economy. So basically, if the industrial unions were to take control of the vertically integrated supply chains of the increasingly horizontally monopolized private corporations, they would have then replaced the entire capitalist system and rendered the political state irrelevant. Quote, its industrial departments were to act as syndicalist shadows of American capitalism so that after a revolution they could quickly step in and help govern a workers' commonwealth. And this is something that I remember a few months ago, we had a discussion about Amazon and this idea that, well, maybe Amazon could be converted into a state-owned, monopoly utility now that it just controls everything. And that's sort of like a communist takeover vision or socialist takeover vision of Amazon. And the syndicalists were, for their day, whether it's, U.S. Steel or Standard Oil or whatever, they were offering a counter vision, which is this direct worker takeover by a giant union representing every single worker in every single aspect of the governance of this company. So their position is, we know how to run these companies better because we're the ones who actually run them, and we would have, in theory, not practice necessarily, in theory, you would have members represented in every single aspect of operating this company, not even some of the white-collar jobs like the stenographers and so forth, right? You would have people who understood from top to bottom how to make these companies run, and then you wouldn't need to break up these companies. You would just take them over, and that would be your revolution, fait accompli. The industrial unions of the corporate trusts era were never actually managed in practice to unionize these monopolies either. That's why we didn't experience the destruction of the political state and the overthrow of capitalism by industrial unionism. But while the progressive movement of the era was turning to trust-busting legislation to try to break the emerging cartels, that proved to be as much of a failure. In our popular imagination, we talk about, TR and Taft and the trust busting. That actually didn't really do a whole lot. By the middle of the Hoover administration, these cartel companies probably engulfed more of the entire U.S. economy than they had at the end of the 19th century. So the IWW was formed in 1905, the industrial workers of the world, in no small part to attempt to seek a more permanent syndicalist fix to the problem by organizing every single American worker into a single union that could not be played off another union at the same company, and which could eventually be positioned as this shadow government system to take worker control of a given corporation away from whatever family or individual controlled it. That didn't pan out, but that was the objective, a workers' monopoly to defeat the capitalist corporate monopolies. Renshaw also calls this dual purpose, quote, both the embryo of the new society and the revolutionary instrument for achieving it, i.e. through a, quote, series of strikes leading to a general strike which would force the capitalists to capitulate. So that's sort of the ideological basis of what they were going for. And I wondered if you guys had comments on that, because again, I think that that's one of the things that's potentially the most resonant today in terms of the echoes we're seeing, which is this idea of what do we do about these huge corporations? Do we take this Elizabeth Warren approach of trying to break them up and pass trust-busting legislation, even though we keep seeing it getting rolled back to square one? Or do we pursue some other model, not necessarily this, but some other more durable model of actually dealing with these corporations?
Yeah, isn't that something that Bernie has kind of talked about? Like if a company, if they file for bankruptcy, like first offer has to go to the workers to see if they want to like buy up the company and run it themselves. Or isn't that like one of his
although that would only really be relevant in the case of a bankruptcy, right? Whereas in this case, I mean, I guess you could force them to bankruptcy through a strike, but yeah. Nate?
Bernie is a stealth De Leonist.
Yeah.
Which is like I haven't even seen that many people try to be like a hipster and be like, oh yeah, I'm a De Leonist. Like,
I mean, that's got to be coming back soon, right? Like everything under the sun.
I have seen it a bit on Twitter, but like, most people go for like, oh, Posadism. Oh, Enver Hoxha is cool. There are bunkers or something. But this is maybe a little more related to America. So I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, Renshaw notes that Lenin really loved De Leon and thought that De Leon had done the most to, like, you know, because there were a lot of people who would say, well, this is what Marx said, and here's my, like, unique take on it or my spin on it. And obviously the most famous of all of them is Lenin himself, and that's where we get the, you know, Marxist-Leninist, you know, adaptation of Marxism. But Lenin thought that De Leon was, like, the most innovative, or the only one, actually, I think he said he was the only one who had contributed anything interesting after Marx to, like, sort of the core theory or what it might look like. Now, obviously the Americans didn't really agree with that, and De Leon had a lot of issues, as we'll talk about in a minute, but that was sort of the Lenin's take on it. So, you know, we've talked about certainly a whole lot of these mining strikes and stuff that happened in places like Colorado and Idaho. You know, it's good that we've talked about all of those, because that ends up being sort of the core genesis of this movement toward the creation of one big union. So in 1897, the Western Federation of Miners not only left the AFL, but in mid-1898 had formed a Western Labor Union, vowing to, quote, organize all labor west of the Mississippi, irrespective of occupation, nationality, creed, or color. Now, I want to stress here, a lot of what we're talking about here is very theoretical and never actually happened in practice. And this is sort of the ongoing theme of much of American leftism, is some very grandiose goals that never got anywhere close to practice. But that was their objective. This overly ambitious objective was an immediate forerunner to the IWW's vision of one big union encompassing all workers. But of course, it was basically just the miners from the WFM union that were making this declaration without really getting too many other occupations on board first. While their lofty stated goal was not really being met, they still set about immediately launching mining strikes all across the Mountain West region, building more support for a direct action approach and more militancy. By 1902, they had gotten Eugene Debs on board, in addition to their existing leaders like Bill Haywood, and Debs advised them to aim even higher and become the American Labor Union, with the objective of representing all workers across the entire nation. Having Debs sign on to the project brought together at least that portion of rail workers who preferred industry-wide unionism over occupation-specific unionism. He was then followed shortly thereafter by key figures from the Brewers, by some cross-border unionists from Canada, and by the U.S. branch of the Amalgamated Society of Engineers of Great Britain. And that group had been having a lot of jurisdictional disputes with the AFL's craft unions, because they represented a more industrial structure, and all of the craft unions that worked in the relevant occupations were, you know, protective and jealous of the areas that they had negotiated to control. And then this brings us to the first of our most famous female trade unionists, Mother Jones, who was very popular with both the militant miners and militant rail workers, and she signed on to this effort as well, this emerging effort, which would eventually become the IWW. So, Rachel, can you tell us about Mother Jones? Not the magazine.
Yeah, the good one, as we said in the show notes. So Mother Jones was kind of radicalized after her husband and their 4 children died in 1867 during a yellow fever epidemic. So after that happened, she was just kind of alone, and she went to Chicago to begin a dressmaking business. And so she did work for upper class Chicagoans in the 1870s and the 1880s. And then she lost her home, shop, and possessions in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And she helped rebuild the city. And during this time of rebuilding the city, she joined the Knights of Labor, like you said, that kind of proto-union. And during that time, she started organizing strikes. And there was a lot of police pushback. They killed many protesters and broke up a lot of strikes and protests. And the Knights mainly attracted men, but by the middle of the 1870s, numbers leaped to more than 1 million, including women. And they became the largest labor organization in the country. And then, as we'll kind of go into more detail later, she was involved in the Haymarket Riot of 1886, And the fear of anarchism, this led to a backlash against anarchism, and the kind of like violent tactics incited by union organizations resulted in the demise of the Knights of Labor. And once the Knights ceased to exist, then she became involved mainly with the United Mine Workers. She frequently led the UMW strikers in picketing and encouraged striking workers to stay on strike when management brought in strike breakers and militias. She wasn't exactly feminist or as feminist as some of the other women we're going to talk about later. She believed that, quote, working men deserved a wage that would allow women to stay home to care for their kids. And she was also kind of against the women's suffrage movement. She didn't really want to get involved in the feminist movement at that time.
I would have to imagine probably some of that was a concern that if a bunch of middle class and rich ladies got the right to vote, that they would be exercising it more than, working class women, and that would cancel out a lot of votes of working class men.
Right. She was quoted as saying that you don't need the vote to raise hell, and she's not an anti to anything which brings freedom to my class. So like you said, I think the suffrage movement was very upper and middle class white women. So she kind of was working more for the class side of things. And
I mean, this goes to this central issue as well, which is that if you were a hardcore industrial trade unionist, you didn't believe in political action at all. It was the vote was completely irrelevant. And even if you got the vote for women, you still had tons of immigrants who didn't have the right to vote regardless of gender. And obviously also, the Jim Crow prohibitions on black people voting as well in the South. So you can kind of understand where she's coming from on that, which is this is relevant to some people, but it's not really relevant to her struggle and vision for a syndicalist or anarchist future or whatever you want to call it.
Right. Yeah. So during her time as an organizer and educator in strike, she was involved mainly with the UMW and also the Socialist Party of America. And as a union organizer, she gained prominence for organizing the wives and children of striking workers in demonstrations on their behalf. And she was termed, quote, the most dangerous woman in America by a West Virginian district attorney, Reese Blizzard, in 1902 at her trial for ignoring an injunction banning meetings by striking miners. He also said she comes into a state where peace and prosperity reign, crooks her finger, and 20,000 contented men lay down their tools and walk out.
Yeah, they're definitely contented up until that point.
Yeah, I highly doubt they were content with their lot in life. So she co-founded the IWW in 1905, and she kind of dressed to look older than she was, kind of in keeping with this Mother Jones title. She claimed her 100th birthday was on May 1st, and kind of had a big party, a big workers' party, basically. It's unknown what her true age is, but she was definitely much younger than her stated age to kind of play up that kind of frail old woman leading the charge kind of image that she had. But she definitely used that image to her advantage in bringing people together to strike for better conditions, especially with the miners' strikes.
Nate, I was sitting here imagining, do you think Clara Jeffrey and Kevin Drum can get 20,000 people out in the streets by crooking their finger?
What about Ben Dreyfuss?
Oh my God, yeah, I forgot he's there too. What a disaster of a magazine.
I mean, it's just on fire. It's a train wreck at this point, but that sort of makes it entertaining. Because the joke about Mother Jones rolling in her grave, that's now years old at this point. We just say it over and over again, but there's nothing going to change there. So,
all right. Well, as Rachel said, Mother Jones was one of the co-founders of the IWW in 1905. So we're finally at that point now where we can talk about the IWW. So Mother Jones, all these other various union guys, Debs, Haywood, all these different people come together as a revolutionary cadre of leaders in 1905 who were prepared in secret to establish an American organization with, very importantly, a transnational aspect. There was an element of global revolution to this, that was seeking not only to represent all workers across all occupations and industries, but also to organize that working class into what they called, quote, approximately the same groups and departments and industries that workers would assume in the working class administration of the cooperative commonwealth that would follow the revolution. So this was an explicitly revolutionary vision, not socialist, though. It was syndicalist, trade unionist, anarchist, whatever you want to call it. They hadn't quite nailed down the details on that. But this was an alternative leftist vision of a workers' revolution and a workers' state. The cooperative commonwealth was certainly more of a state than, a pure anarchist might want. They held a founding conference in Chicago for the new industrial workers of the world in the summer of 1905 and took direct inspiration from the rising power of France's syndicalist CGT, although the CGT still had not yet taken on some of its more explicitly anarchist and violent doctrines that it would within a year or so. The IWW also perhaps fatally tried to follow the recently adopted CGT-FBT French model of twin organization along both industrial and craft union lines with lingering local or regional autonomy for craft unions, despite the problems that this had already caused in the U.S. during situations like the Pullman strike, where they needed local craft unions to have gotten on board with industrial work stoppage attempts nationwide, and this simply did not happen. So again, if you missed it earlier, go back into the earlier part of the episode where we talk about Russell going over that twin model with the CGT and the FBT and the merger between the two of them, and you can understand what it was that they were attempting to model there, and that combination had only happened about 3 years earlier. And the conference goers were also inspired by the unfolding abortive Russian Revolution of 1905, which was happening concurrently to the formational conference, or the founding conference convention of the IWW. So in some respects, they thought, as many people thought, in around 1917, 1918, that the world was on a precipice and there was about to be a global workers' revolution. That didn't actually happen, but that's what they were thinking at the time. The big sort of founding problem with the IWW, of course, was that they still also did not actually have much buy-in from unions outside of their core. So they had expanded from mines to rail and then metal and machines, but beyond that, they still didn't really have a lot of reach, which is not a great start for a union that's attempting to organize every single person in all occupations and whatever into a single working class union across all industries. The second IWW convention in 1906 was a total disaster, with a number of the more impressive founding figures in jail or otherwise occupied. On a previous episode, you'll remember that we talked about Haywood being kidnapped by the Pinkertons and put on trial for the bombing assassination of Idaho's governor. There was also a significant factional fight that even included the leadership inexplicably calling the cops on their rivals. And then those rivals, in turn, trying to appeal to the court system for help winning control of the organization, by, they didn't follow the bylaws and that kind of thing, which is very not good behavior for revolutionary leftists, IMHO. Disgusted moderates either quit the IWW at this point or reconfirmed earlier decisions not to join if they had been on the fence, and many of them began abandoning direct action confrontational approaches toward the capitalist owner in favor of more conciliatory negotiations, which seemed to be getting better results at this point. Now, I would note here that Renshaw doesn't actually say if this had anything to do with the fact that the long recession period of the 1870s to the 1890s had ended. That was a period where wages had been falling. Now we were in a period where there were more generally rising wages. I'm not really sure. I'm just wondering about that, and it wasn't really spelled out in the book. But perhaps the killing blow to the nascent IWW was the departure of the Western Federation of Mine Workers. So they had basically been the genesis of this entire project, and they had the most resources and manpower. But they got so upset by what a mess things were that they just left, even though this had been kind of their idea from the beginning. So that exodus itself took a bitter 2-year saga, and that concluded in 1908. Now, Nate, I hear you sighing. Are you thinking about our modern-day counterparts of fracturing and splintering leftists?
Well, there's a little bit of that.
Bit of a habit.
Yeah.
The third convention of the IWW in 1908 then purged anyone still remaining who was willing to entertain political participation instead of revolutionary industrialism. Now, I say anyone. There were a couple people like Haywood who were kind of willing to dabble around with political stuff, and they weren't expelled, but like the socialists, the parliamentary socialists, those types were expelled. All the socialists of various alignments were basically gone, and the IWW was, at this point, definitively syndicalist in its ideological alignment. But they were actually busy out in the field during this period, so even though things were not going very well institutionally, they were, getting up to some things from 1905 to 1908. They were organizing window washers, restaurant workers, rodeo cowboys, which I had not thought about that, but that's an interesting one. Newspaper production, delivery workers, Western Union delivery boys. Unfortunately, these tended to be fairly brief labor actions with fairly short-lived unions. The IWW also increasingly came into conflict in this period with craft union workers who refused to join them. The printers and the carpenters in particular refused to join, and this caused all kinds of problems. A lot of times because they were much, much stronger unions, and they could create a lot of problems for the IWW. The IWW almost collapsed completely in 1907 when a financial panic wiped out most of their resources and their local unions, but it gained a new lease on life in 1909 when a U.S. steel subsidiary in Pennsylvania tried to change their pay system to a complicated piecework-based system that confused and alienated their workers, especially those who did not speak English. And this is sort of a critical turning point in American syndicalism, where they begin to more explicitly embrace or start to embrace the uniquely immigrant characteristics of their movement and their labor movement and working class, as opposed to, say, the European movements and working classes. 6,000 workers went on strike in this community in Pennsylvania. The IWW was brought in, much in the French model of this advisory capacity, to help establish an organization from scratch. A picketing Czech worker was killed by company guards. Funeral eulogies were given in 15 different languages. A young general executive board member of the IWW, Joseph Ettore, spoke English, Italian, and Polish, and he helped usher in a new era of IWW focusing around Eastern industrial immigrant workers, although he also had a background in the Western work, which helped him sort of bridge that gap. IWW propaganda began referring to police as Cossacks at the suggestion of Russian workers who were at this McKees Rocks strike. And the violence against the strikers specifically often took the form of mounted local and state police attacking from horseback. That was where they came up with the Cossacks name. Public opinion in Western Pennsylvania soured toward the company and went in favor of the strikers as a result of these cavalry charges, and they surrendered completely to worker demands. In 1909, nearly half of all remaining IWW member workers were on strike somewhere in the United States for some reason or another, which was sort of consistent with this philosophy of just constantly staging strikes, limited, and specific strikes over and over and over again, everywhere you could, whenever you could, until you finally reached this point of a general strike where the entire U.S. economy would shut down. But the problem with this is that while it was an impressive feat, it also meant that anybody on strike wasn't paying dues, and that hurt the finances of the IWW, which meant they couldn't pay organizers. There was also a little bit of a flash here of anarchism and mutual aid in the sort of more theoretical context. Early efforts by governments to legislate against the anarcho-syndicalist IWW focused on trying to ban them from giving these street corner soapbox speeches telling the truth about terrible working conditions in the U.S. The IWW would mobilize a national network of itinerant hobo soapboxers to ride the rails and flood into any community that tried to ban these speeches. They would overwhelm and agitate the local prisons when they got arrested, and then eventually the local government would panic in all of the chaos and relent and repeal the law. These networks could mobilize hundreds or even thousands of IWW protesters to suddenly show up at a given location. Now, one of the key figures in this is another one that Rachel's going to talk about, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was also an early figure at one of the early conventions of the IWW as a teen riot girl, a teen anarcho-syndicalist. So tell us about her, Rachel.
So Elizabeth Gurley Flynn started her career at age 17. She was a soapbox orator, kind of centered in New York City. Renshaw said she was known as a working class Joan of Arc. She was also a teenage delegate to the IWW convention of 1908. one of the main things she did is she exposed abuses by police and prison guards at women's prisons and jails, where they were extorting sexual activities from inmates or detainees. This helped rally public opinion to be more favorable toward the IWW. She organized campaigns among garment workers in Pennsylvania, silk weavers in New Jersey, restaurant workers in New York, miners in Minnesota, Missoula, Montana, and Spokane, Washington, and textile workers in Massachusetts. She also, in 1909, she participated in a free speech fight in Spokane. She chained herself to a lamppost in order to delay her arrest. And she also accused the police there as using the jail as a brothel. And then the police in Spokane tried to confiscate all copies of the journal Industrial Worker that was reporting this charge. So she was definitely kind of a rabble rouser, and it's pretty awesome to see all these young girls that were involved in the movement being such huge forces in organizing and getting things done.
Now, returning to our sort of narrative in the development of the IWW, there was immense violence in Southern California against trade unionists after a 1912 bombing and accidental fire at the anti-union Los Angeles Times building. The IWW was falsely accused of perpetrating this. They actually had nothing to do with it. And the IWW expressed some pretty vocal concern that the AFL was not doing enough to stand with them as this chaos was unfolding and they had people on trial and so forth. So the AFL actually, put aside some of the rivalry and tried to work a little bit harder in some incidents that happened in Washington State to cooperate with the IWW when there were these bursts of violence against workers and, help with the trials and things like that. But there was a lot of tension around the situation after the Los Angeles Times bombing because, they had a different philosophy on how it wasn't even an approach over the tactics during the actual labor dispute. It was what to do in the aftermath and with the legal court cases. But after these there was this, this soapbox phase and these clashes. We then arrive back at what we talked about on a relatively recent episode, the 1912 Lawrence, Massachusetts textile mill strike, which shifts the IWW's focus. 9-week strike coincides with a wave of strike action across the entire English-speaking world of the British Empire. The IWW was actually sending advisors to those. We'll get back to that in a little bit. And at the time, Lawrence, Massachusetts had 86,000 residents. 60,000 of them, including family members of the workers, depended directly on mill wages. 30,000 men and women worked themselves in the mill, or in one of these mills. Overwhelmingly, the town was either first-generation American or immigrant. They represented 25 or more nationalities. A pay cut in the second week of January 1912 happened at the same time as the pioneering Massachusetts minimum wage and maximum hours law for women and children, which was being rolled out that year. This had been something we've talked about that on a previous episode, certainly, but that was the first minimum wage law in the country, and this was going to affect some of these workers, and there was this pay cut happening. About 10 or 15,000 workers walked out immediately, triggering sort of a general strike citywide. I mean, it doesn't quite rise to the level of a general strike at this point, but could have potentially gone in that direction and effectively did toward the end of it. Many immigrant groups did not join until later, however, but there was a very small local IWW. In fact, they were so small, it was like a couple hundred people that initially it was like, well, they're a joke. They can't possibly do anything. But they wired for emergency help from national leadership, a lot of whom, like people like Flynn, were based in New York rather than Chicago. They arrived quickly on the scene. A number of these leaders from outside were arrested and held without trial for months. The Massachusetts militia arrives. They fire water hoses into the strikers on January 15th, a few days into the strike, and the workers became so enraged that they committed to following through on the general strike in progress. Now, again, we talked about this on a previous episode. You had these French and Belgian syndicalists with a bakery that was keeping people fed. They were very active in this strike. Unfortunately, the Irish and English immigrant communities in the city tended to undermine the strike. The Irish were actually now in control of city government. Some of them purchased and planted dynamite trying to frame IWW leaders unsuccessfully. And then We're going to talk in part 2 about the role of sort of the Italian-American community in this movement, but suffice it to say at this point, the Italians were divided. Some of them served as the core of the strikers, some of them sided with management and the city, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that was when we get to that subtopic. Nate, I thought you would get a kick out of this, the aspect of the Massachusetts militia and who they were. Renshaw says they were essentially largely nativists, multi-generational Americans who had been here a long time, their families had been here a long time, and quote-unquote young professionals drawn heavily from Harvard. So, yeah. I mean, any thoughts on Harvard's role in the class struggle?
Well, it's been a good week of PR for Harvard, I would say. A lot of good pictures of one Jay Epstein in a Harvard sweatshirt been making the rounds.
Mr. A. Dershowitz.
Well, a lot of money been funded into Harvard, and basically they're just a slush fund anyway. So
yeah. So apparently a lot of these guys took a real sick pleasure of going up to serve militia duty in Lawrence so they could beat the hell out of strikers. Big surprise. Then we also had anarchists arrive from Boston, although these may have been actually agents working for the management or for the government. It's still unclear. They brought a bunch of signs with atheist slogans that alienated a lot of the workers. The IWW had to eventually, as this strike continued for months, had to evacuate thousands of starving children to support her homes across the Northeast as the privations grew. This proved to be such an effective propaganda tool to demonstrate the abusive siege against the workers that the militia and police began trying to stop the evacuations and arresting mothers on neglect charges. The U.S. Solicitor General, one of the highest-ranking law people in the country and the government, condemned this intervention, saying it's any parent's right to send their child to a home anywhere where they would be safer and better fed. And at this point, American middle-class opinion turned in favor of the strikers, despite their misgivings about revolutionary and anarchist rhetoric or descriptions of tactics of sabotage and things like that. And there were soon newspaper editorials across the country raising questions not only about the mill owners in Lawrence, but about the entire U.S. textile industry, which was heavily benefiting from a federal tariff regime. So to avoid a very serious review of U.S. policy on their entire industry, which would obviously be much more expensive than giving in to worker demands, the American Woolen Company decided to raise wages in 33 cities. They, a few days later, bumped pay for 125,000 mill workers in 6 states. And then soon after, a number of other textile companies announced pay raises, overtime pay, and worker protections. The strike ended, and a wave of smaller textile strikes across New England quickly ended with similar surrender to worker demands. Unfortunately, as elsewhere, the IWW was unable to capitalize on a major victory by putting down roots and building infrastructure, and the hard-won gains quickly fizzled away. Now, I want to double back a little bit here, Rachel, to the part about the children being evacuated. We have another female figure, not an anarchist so much as a socialist, but obviously a very well-known figure in American history and feminist history, Margaret Sanger. So she was the one who was organizing these evacuations of the children. So could you talk a little bit about her? Obviously a bit of a controversial figure because, the eugenics, but...
Yeah, and she's well known for founding Planned Parenthood of America, and also kind of her activism surrounding providing education about birth control to women. But in 1912, she did help evacuate starving children during the Lawrence Mill strike. She was a part of the Women's Committee of the New York Socialist Party. She also took part in the 1913 Patterson Silk Strike, so involved in like textile strikes. And
Coming
she
up
was
next.
involved. Yeah, she was involved with local intellectuals, left-wing artists, socialists, and social activists, kind of the Greenwich Village bohemia. So some of the people she was associated with is John Reed, Upton Sinclair, Mabel Dodge, and Emma Goldman, another eminent woman of the anarchist left.
So as you said, she was involved with the 1913 Patterson, New Jersey textile strike. This followed the one in Lawrence, looked like it might initially follow the Lawrence track, but the owners were a lot more prepared, and they were specifically more prepared to take extreme measures. There were various innovative tactics by the IWW. Jack Reed, who was a journalist, he ended up dying in the Soviet Union during a typhoid outbreak, but Nate, you might recognize the name there from that Kaiser Reich mod of Hearts of Iron 4, where Jack Reed is the the American syndicalist leader who becomes the breakaway leader in the Second Civil War, because in this vision he didn't die in the Soviet Union in that alternate history. But anyway, at this time period, he's this young up and coming journalist. He comes up with this thing. They're going to put on a pageant at Madison Square Garden in New York to dramatize what the demands of the strikers were and stuff, which anyway, I guess it sort of worked, but it also didn't, and it caused a lot of problems internally. And there was just a lot of concern that it was sort of distracting people from, the strike, which was the whole point. There were also these alleged extreme anarchists. A lot of the IWW syndicalists, like Flynn, alleged basically forever that they believed that there was a strong chance that they were either working for the owners or working for the government directly as, disruption and provocation and so forth. They showed up and made extreme demonstrations like flag burning and stuff that made a lot of the immigrant workers very uncomfortable at best, and at worst fearful that they might get expelled from the country. So the Paterson, New Jersey strike ended in almost total failure, with 300 different contract agreements between the various mills and workers instead of one citywide contract favored by the IWW. In both Lawrence and Paterson, the mill owners made sure also to invest, especially, while not a lot of work was happening, in equipment upgrades and line production changes and methodology changes that would allow them to make their workers work faster and produce more for the new pay rate, thereby rendering any gains from the strike meaningless. And again, this leads into the problem that if the IWW can't put down roots and organize more permanently, any of the gains won will evaporate, and that's not really helpful. So we're almost now up to, this is the final sort of pre-war period before World War I, and we're almost to the end of that. There were some rare Southern successes for the syndicalists in the pre-World War I period. Now, last week, Nate and Greg and I talked about communist organizing of sharecroppers and so forth in the American South. But the syndicalists in World War I had some successes in places like Louisiana. They formed mixed locals of black and white loggers because they needed to make sure that the owners could not replace striking workers of one race with scab workers of the other race during labor disputes. And apparently the workers got along pretty well together in these mixed race unions, and this worked pretty well. The IWW also informally supported Eugene Debs' 1912 presidential run, despite their sort of nominal opposition to political participation, and they saw a lot of successes in single-party strongholds of the Democratic Party, like the South. So, the Republicans were not going to do well in the South to begin with, but it wasn't a huge, it wasn't a uniform shutout of all other parties, because Debs actually did well in these areas like Louisiana, where there had been this organizing. Now, when we say well, we're not talking about like, he almost got 50%. We're talking about like a noticeable number of thousands of votes. Unfortunately, during this 1912 election, the Socialist Party ejected the syndicalists during this campaign from their party and formally denounced violence, sabotage, and crime. This was, a lot of the municipal socialists led the charge on this, distancing themselves from this violence, sabotage, and crime. And Renshaw notes that this exact same anti-sabotage language would become the basis a few years later of the anti-syndicalism wave of legislation, which we'll be talking about in part 2. Finally, the IWW also became increasingly divided internally over decentralizing anarchists versus centralizing syndicalists, who felt that the IWW would keep failing or losing momentum if it did not have stronger national leadership and permanent on-the-ground field organizers, which cost money that required national resources. The anarchist wing was more popular in the western U.S. That has a lot to do with sort of a bunch of young men, typically unmarried, moving around from place to place, mining communities, or they would be loggers, or they would work in the docks, and in many cases they would switch occupations from year to year. So they didn't want a whole lot of centralization, and it wasn't necessarily appropriate to their experience either. The syndicalist tendency was more popular within the Eastern industrial immigrant communities, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the role of the immigrants in this. The syndicalists were also divided on whether, amongst themselves, on whether to focus on competing with the AFL or trying to take it over, as the French had done, because the CGT was the French equivalent of the AFL and then got taken over by syndicalists and made into a syndicalist body. However, the French syndicalists were actually also divided on the same exact questions at the same time on their future direction, despite their capture of the CGT. So it's not clear necessarily that this would have worked. Moreover, the AFL was so focused on skilled labor and expensive apprenticeships that it was unclear on how the working poor unskilled laborers would be able to make the jump into the AFL in the first place if there was a plan to infiltrate it. So there was a lot of impediments there. And then it was also clear to everyone of all tendencies in the IWW that this approach of wildcat striking and coming in as advisors temporarily was maybe effective among the transient workers with seasonal jobs, but it was not the best approach to the urban factories, and there needed to be a strategic change on that front. The question was how to do that. Another key step, and this is one of the most interesting ones in my view, and this is as we're getting into World War I now, but not the U.S. part of World War I. Another key step by the IWW was a 1914 convention decision to begin organizing the unemployed members of the working class, which I would note, the IWW today is relatively small, but one of the things that they work on is trying to organize unemployed and homeless people into unions so that they can advocate for themselves and educate, pass around informational things like that. So that legacy remains in place. But they wanted to organize unemployed members of the working class in 1914, not only to help them find jobs, but also to make it easier for them to avoid serving as surplus labor force scab workers during strike. This followed a successful 1913 campaign to organize seasonal farm laborers across the Midwest, who spent much of the year, from year to year, struggling to find work between the harvests, and then lived in horrid conditions during the actual harvest season for not very much money. The IWW's previous experience with the hobo networks for soapbox protests made them very experienced at formalizing rail-hopping migrants into unions, and they issued them these little red cards that carried a great deal of respect. By 1916, the Agricultural Workers Organization, and this is 3 years after this campaign in 1913, had become a massive force within the IWW and was raking in the dues money and winning fight after fight with farm owners because the farm owners could not afford to let their crops spoil during a strike. The centralizers had won control of the leadership of the IWW, but then paradoxically, the IWW's strongest branch all of a sudden was a highly decentralized union of seasonal and mostly unemployed farm workers. And that was the final year before the U.S. entry into World War I in 1917, which starts off the first Red Scare, and we get the emergence of a strong communist state in Russia as an attractive and powerful force on left-wing revolutionary politics. So in our next part, we're going to talk about some other things like that. But this is sort of bringing us to a close on the first part. The last thing I will say about this, of course, is that, there were various other short-lived splinter groups that influenced some of these decisions at the time. There was a Syndicalist League of North America. They thought, we're going to infiltrate the conventional craft unions. That didn't really happen. Interestingly, the IWWs had a branch in Australia. Their slogan, the same thing there, one big union, and that actually still exists as a pretty significant force today in Australia. Its descendant is the Australian Council of Trade Unions, formed in 1927 by revolutionary syndicalists. They opposed the conciliatory unionism of the Australian Workers' Union, but eventually the ACTU did become parliamentarist as well, and their ACTU president, Bob Hawke, became the prime minister in 1983 and led a pretty successful government. Renshaw argues in his 1967 book that Australia and New Zealand came to American syndicalism as opposed to European models because of similar fading national mythologies around frontier farming and pasturing, this idea of the closing of the frontier and so forth. I suspect it might actually have more to do with some early legal decisions that empowered trade unions in certain specific ways, favoring an industrial approach over a political approach. That was something during the unification of the Australian colonies and sort of the formation of a home rule New Zealand. In that late 19th century phase, and early 20th century, there were some legal cases that I don't want to go too far into because we've talked about them on previous episodes, but they were fairly influential in empowering the trade unions, and I think that probably helped and made it so that it wasn't as necessary to go seek legal remedies. You don't need to get a law passed if a judge will hand you a decision. For example, the Australian minimum wage law was not something that was passed by Parliament. It was something that a judge handed down saying, hey, you actually have to pay a certain level of wages that can sustain a household so they don't starve to death. And that was sort of hugely influential for the rest of the world, but the rest of the world then adopted that through parliamentarism more than this other approach, but that wasn't the same context. So I don't know if I agree with Renshaw's analysis there. And then, of course, just flashing forward a little bit so we understand kind of the trajectory of where things were going. In 1936, a number of industrial-oriented unions broke away from the craft union-dominated AFL to form the Congress for Industrial Organizations, later Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, which did not end its rivalry until they merged back together to the AFL-CIO in 1955. That's obviously not the time period we're talking about here. But one thing that is stressed, is especially by Renshaw, is that the CIO had a key advantage in the 1930s over the IWW in the first and second decade of the 20th century, in that the people they were attempting to organize were the English-speaking children of the multilingual immigrants who had formed a core base of support of the IWW decades earlier. And again, we're going to talk in part 2 more heavily about this immigrants issue and how that influenced things. But that sort of shows where things were going in the overall trajectory.